Hello. Hi. Every now and then I say yes to something. I pretty regularly say yes to something. I don't think saying yes to everything is a desirable trait for a human being to have. I think it's important to be able to say no to things too, with respect to your energy levels and like. But sometimes I have like energy to do fun things, and so I say yes to stuff like giving a lecture about statistics to a high school statistics, AP statistics course, which is something that I will be doing tomorrow morning. Um, so I feel a little bit like I'm in high school right now. I've just like finished my presentation for the class the night before it's due and everything like that. And I thought I would go over it um, and upload it to YouTube because every time I make a presentation like this and put it on YouTube, like at least two or three people have really good feedback. Like, oh, you could be more clear by saying this and this and this, or this would be a really good addition or something like that. So I thought I would upload this, go to sleep, then in the morning I can check the comments and be like, that's a good addition. I bet they'll like that. This is meant to run 30 minutes. I think right now it's more like 20 minutes or so. So there's definitely time for me to add another slide or answer some questions at the end or whatever. Who knows? But anyway, when thinking about what I wanted to tell a collection of students who are in AP statistics about statistics, the thing that stood out to me was sample sizes. I wanted to tell them what I thought about sample sizes because I feel like when I was taught statistics, uh, and also before I was taught statistics, when statistics were shown to me in the world, um, what a sample size meant was communicated to me in a very misleading way. In fact, sometimes it was just completely wrong. That's what this presentation is kind of mostly about. So, I'm going to start with the smallest sample size we can have for data, which is n equals 1. N just means the size of the sample. So n equals 1 means there is one data point in our database or whatever. And usually when we talk about having one data point, we're talking about anecdotes and outliers. Those are the two main things that having one data point would be about. An anecdote, like I drank honey last night and now my throat is feeling better. Um, Often people get in trouble mistaking anecdotes for like knowledge of medicine compared to like doctor's advice. And outliers, things like there was this one person who survived a fall from a plane that was miles up in the air and was just completely fine. It's an outlier. That's not something that lots of people have done. There was just like one person who did that one time. I'm sure there's more than one person who survived a fall from a plane like that, but it's not common. Um, but anecdotes and outliers, while they're often kind of dismissed and overlooked in statistics, like generally the conclusion we have about someone falling out of a plane is yes, that will probably be fatal if the plane happened to be in the air when they fell out. Um, Unless they were wearing a parachute or what have you. Generally, statistically, we'll say that. However, just noticing that, there have been people who have fallen out of a plane that was high in the air and survived does clue you into the idea that like that is possible somehow. You only need to observe something happening one time to know that that thing can happen, which is a really big thing that n equals 1 can do for you. Most people would agree that coins can land on heads or tails, but can they also land on an edge? Is an interesting question, I think. I've kind of wondered this in my life because I can balance something on its edge, but I've never flipped a coin and actually had it land on its edge when I flipped it. And I've flipped a good number of coins in my life, I feel like. So, I mean, physically, it seems like it could be possible, but I haven't personally ever seen it. But then, in order to confirm that coins could land on their edge, all I would need would be to see it happen one time. Um, you can get into weird stuff with conditions. Like maybe you could flip a coin if it was very muddy and rainy and you were standing on grass. Maybe you could flip a coin and it would land on its edge in that sort of situation. Like that wouldn't. Does that mean it can land on its edge when you flip it and it lands on a wooden floor? But n equals 1 can actually be quite powerful. In fact, sometimes observations with n equals 1 are extremely powerful, like even more powerful than lots of other data that says a different thing. This is an anecdote that I have shared a few times. Anecdotes, also an n=1 example. But my uncle once ran a class study observing fish. He was a university lecturer at Massey University. And he noticed that one of his students was recording very different data from the other students. So what they were doing is they had a tank of fish, and all of the students took turns over the course of the semester going in and writing down data about the fish and how the fish were behaving. They do this multiple times over the course of the semester each. And the idea was that at the end, they'll have some data about the fish and they can analyze the data and draw some conclusions about what the fish are like. But one of the students in the class was getting very different data from all the other students. All the other students were getting mostly the same sorts of things. The fish like went to go eat the same amount of times. They were active the same percentage of the time. They were hiding or resting the same percentage of the time or what have you. But this one student was getting very, very different data. The fish were drastically different in terms of measurements of their activity and appetite and so on. So something that I think is interesting to consider is just like how many explanations can there be for this? Data doesn't come from nowhere. There has to be some mechanism by which a data point has been created. You can't see data in the world unless it's possible for that data to occur somehow. So one explanation could be like the student didn't actually go in to take measurements on the fish and just made it up. That could be one thing. They just weren't actually doing the assignment. Another could be they were mistaken about how they were meant to measure data on the fish. Another could be maybe they went in at a different time from other people. Maybe they went in at 7 a.m. and other people went in at 1 p.m. and maybe fish are different at different times of day. That's one where like how you organize the collection of the data needs to take that into account. So by thinking through all the explanations for this, we can start to think about like ways that our data collection might be flawed. You want to make sure you're getting data from all different times of day. You want to make sure that every student is seeing something and recording it as the same sort of thing. Like maybe this student was seeing a fish do a certain thing and was saying that that counted as active, whereas other people would have seen the fish do that and not said it counted as active. Something like that. I don't know. Um, there are tons and tons and tons of possible explanations for this. Um, some of the explanations I think are quite obvious and intuitive to me, and others that I have come up with over the course of like 5 to 10 years of sometimes idly wondering about this are a lot less likely. But the incredible thing to me about this story is that, see, I got told the answer when I heard the story for the first time, but I think the actual answer, the actual thing that was actually happening, to me, it's like it's not something that I would think of very quickly. Just thinking about this on my own and trying to work out what might have been the explanation. And so my uncle hypothesized that the student was recording the data incorrectly. That's what he thought might be a likely explanation. And so he observed her while she observed the fish. But she seemed to understand how to record the data just fine. So that had been his first hypothesis, but it didn't seem like it was true. And the next time she went to observe the fish, even though he had observed that she was taking down the notes just fine, she again got completely different results. Now, while he was with her, she showed that she could observe the fish just like everybody else and take down the data just like everybody else and got the same sorts of results as everybody else. But then she went and did it alone again and got completely different results again. And eventually, the class worked out that because she was the shortest student, what was going on was the fish didn't notice that she was in the room. So everybody else had been going to the room to record data on the fish, and the fish had seen them enter the room and been scared. And then they see this human staring at them through the glass, and they're still scared. And they're taking data recordings on stressed out, scared fish. Whereas this one student was short enough that she was below the eye line of the fish, and they didn't realize she was there. And that's why they were different. So all it takes is one data point sometimes to expose a massive flaw in your study. The student who was getting the different results from everyone else was actually the only person who was collecting data that was useful for finding out what the fish were like. Everybody else was collecting data that was only telling them what the fish would be like when they felt threatened, which wasn't the point of the data collection. A point about like anecdotal evidence and small packets of data that we pick up day to day, like just small new pieces of information. Statistical studies can be very slow, so it can take multiple years for a medical study to result in the government approving a new medication for use, for example. But we, personally, as individuals, don't have to be so slow. So you could think something is 100% likely to be true, but then you could see evidence that it wasn't. And that could be enough for you to instantly go from thinking that it was 100% true to thinking that it was 100% false based on a singular point of data. And that's not something that should never happen to you in your life. That's something that should happen to you. And that's something that an understanding of data and how to collect data can enable you to do. This is part of statistics. You could also update your beliefs more slowly, though. That's another option. Perhaps you think the new evidence might be flawed. Instead of downgrading your belief from 100% likely to be true all the way to 0, you could say you now thought it was 95% likely to be true instead of 100% likely to be true. You could say, like, I've seen a lot of evidence in favor of this, but I did just see something that kind of questions it. So now, like, I'm no longer at 100%. Now I'm at like 95%. And you could have lots of things like this in your life. You could be like, I'm 60% confident that this is true. I'm 35% confident that that's true. You don't have to be fully confident one way or the other on things in the world. We constantly get data and evidence supporting something or refuting something from all sorts of different sources. And our job in navigating the world to the best of our ability is to try to have a reasonable opinion on the likelihood that different things are true. Now, yeah, so much of the time we aren't sure whether something is true or not, but we can still have an idea of whether it's impossible, possible, likely, or probable. And if you think about like the job of a weather forecaster, they're not going to tell you with 100% certainty that it's going to rain a week from now, but they can still tell you like, I think there's a 30% chance that it will rain at 2 p.m. tomorrow, which is impressive and useful, even though it isn't certain. So that's some talk about anecdotes and outliers and very small amounts of data. Now let's talk about normal distributions and math. I want to talk about data in the range of 30 to 3,000 data points. This is kind of the amount of data that I was taught statistics was about when I was first being introduced to statistics. And it is where statistics, I think, is the most exciting, for what it's worth. Statisticians can quite accurately explain much of the observable universe using just a few hundred data points and a few different distributions of data. And this is very cool and useful. This is a lot of the value of statistics as a field. Out of the distributions that statisticians use, and I would recommend just checking out the wiki on statistical distributions. I think you can like actually, the wiki on statistical distributions is kind of overwhelming, and there are lots and lots and lots of different ones. If you looked up like most common statistical distributions or main statistical distributions, you'd get a list of maybe 6 instead of a list of, I don't know, 60. In my opinion, though, the easiest distribution to understand is perhaps the binomial distribution. I think the binomial distribution is often the first distribution that people are taught when learning statistics. Binomial means 2, that's Latin, and nomial is nomos, which is part, basically. That one's Greek. So it means 2 parts. It's a distribution with 2 parts. So like a coin toss, for example, assuming that the coin can't land on its edge, which might be true, we say that a coin can land on heads or tails, which means that the outcome of a coin toss has 2 parts, which means it's a binomial distribution. So binomial distribution describes things like how many heads you get in 100 tosses of a coin. And I think that most of us, just through experience in our lives, have developed some sort of intuitive idea about how many heads you might get in 10, 100, or 1,000 tosses of a coin. Maybe that isn't true for everybody in the world, but I think that if you were in an AP statistics class at a high school, probably you've already kind of developed ideas about what may or may not be true about the number of heads you get in that sort of situation. I would say intuitively, without looking it up, that you probably get somewhere between 2 and 8 heads if you toss a coin 10 times, and you probably get somewhere between 40 and 60 heads if you toss a coin 100 times, and you probably get somewhere between 460 to 540 heads if you toss a coin 1,000 times. That would be my kind of ballpark range. Um, so I think like I have some sort of intuition about that, which like may be somewhat accurate. It's certainly not perfect. Um, but it's not completely out of touch with reality. Like I don't think that you regularly only get 50 heads if you toss a coin 1,000 times. And I don't think many people who are studying AP statistics do either. I think as a general rule, we kind of get how that sort of stuff looks. So here's where it gets really wild, though. A lot of the time, an event in the world depends on the outcomes of lots of different variables, each of which pushes the outcome one way or another. Every little thing counts, you know? Uh, does that sound familiar after having talked about tossing a coin 100 times? The thing is, a lot of events that happen in the world, like let's say how tall a tree grows, depend on lots and lots and lots of variables, which could come up one way or the other toward making it taller or shorter. And because of that, they're kind of like tossing a coin lots and lots of times and seeing how many heads you get. Here's a binomial distribution of 150 coin tosses with a probability of 0.5. So this is showing you how many heads you get in 150 coin tosses, and you can see it's pretty normal to get between, I don't know, 65 and 85 or something like that. And I'm comparing it here to the heights of US adult males. And you may notice that the distributions look very similar. Uh, and the reason for that, um, like the the explanation for why those distributions look similar, is that the height of an American adult male is based on lots and lots and lots of small variables, like did they eat well when they were a kid? How tall were their parents? Were they healthy as a child, or did they have illnesses maybe that stunted their growth? Do they have good posture? Have they been injured in some way that has shortened them? So on and so forth. As you get older, your height decreases. So, have you gotten older? Uh, and when you take lots and lots and lots and lots of little variables and see, does the outcome of this variable make me taller or shorter over and over and over again, you'll end up with something that looks kind of like what you get if you flip lots and lots and lots of coins. And that's really powerful because we know all about the math that goes into outcomes from lots and lots and lots and lots of coins. And that math applies, generally speaking, to heights of US adult males as well, even though that doesn't perhaps at first glance seem like it has anything to do with coins whatsoever. There are differences. The math isn't exactly the same, but it's like kind of very similar concepts in a way that is extremely convenient for finding out information about the universe. Sometimes one variable might be more important than others. Not all the coin flips are perhaps equally as important. So when you're talking about distributions of height of American adults, usually you separate into talking about males and females. And you can see there's one coin flip different here, right? One coin flip decided male versus female. I'm simplifying biology slightly, but like more or less, we can abstract that to thinking that it's one coin flip separating these two populations. But you can see that there's actually a large difference. So that coin flip mattered quite a lot. And because of that, the distributions are separate. But if you have lots and lots of coin flips where they don't matter that much, you end up with a distribution that looks more like this. So talk about mean and variance of these distributions. These are very important things to be thinking about when looking at data and statistics. We describe standard distributions, which is what the height of a US adult male is, what we're using to represent the height of US average males, at least, using their mean and their standard deviation. And mean is the average value of the distribution. The average American man is 70.9 inches tall. Cool. Straightforward. I wonder if that number is true. I feel like that number is too high. I'm not actually sure, though. Standard deviation is a lot trickier. Standard deviation, I'm pretty sure I got this right. It's the square root of the average distance between a data point sampled from the distribution and the distribution's mean. Is that a lot of words? Basically, what it means is if the standard distribution's high, then when you sample a point from this distribution, like most commonly you'll get a point in here, but sometimes you get one over here, and sometimes you get one over here. When you sample a point from this distribution, often the square root of the distance between this point and the mean, which is here in the middle, squared, ends up being a higher number than it would in this distribution, where this distribution is narrower. Narrow means lighter, lower standard deviation. Wider means larger standard deviation. A thing that I want to stress about standard deviation is, like, we kind of just made that up as the thing that we say about the distribution. We just kind of decided that mathematically that was how we were going to represent the width of the distribution. Like, the reason that we are squaring the distance isn't, like, in particular that must be the thing that you have to do. The reason historically that the distance gets squared, in my understanding at least, how I was taught in statistics, is that suppose you get this point right here, and that's like minus 3 from the mean or something like that. You want to add up the distances between points that you sample and the mean. And if you're adding up -3 and +3, you get 0, which isn't what you want. You want to add up -3 and +3 and get that both of them were like 3 away, so now you're at 6 perhaps. And one way to do that is to square it, because -3 times -3 is 9, and 3 times 3 is 9. So now you have two positive values, and you end up at 18. But it's all kind of arbitrary. It's kind of just like how we decided to do it. What I would stress about standard deviation is just that it is some way that we are choosing to use to represent how much variance there is in the distribution, like how wide the distribution is. The standard deviation of the height of American males is like probably something like 4 inches, and what that means is that it's pretty unusual to see someone who is 2 feet taller than average or 2 feet shorter than average. Not necessarily that you never will, but it's just like not super common if you're like at the grocery store. Similarly, the mean is a measure of center. That's a measure of like what a very typical value would be in the center of the distribution. And mean isn't the only way that we measure center. You can also measure center by what the most common value that you get is, or by like what value is in the middle if you lined up all the values in a row from lowest to most. Those are other common ways of measuring center, or you could also measure center a different way. Yeah. Basically, we're measuring center and we're measuring how much variance a distribution has. And you'll learn all about the formulae that we use for that and all the equations that you do to calculate them and things like that. But I think the important thing to remember with statistics is that the goal is just to describe the data and say, like, this is its center, this is how much variance it has. So we talked about how like the height of a person is kind of like flipping lots of coins. Well, a beautiful thing about statistics, again, another beautiful thing, is that taking a sample of a bunch of people is also kind of like flipping a lot of coins. So let's say that we're running a polling company and we want to find out who is likely to win the next election. If we sample 300 members of the population and ask who they intend to vote for president, it's a bit like flipping a coin 300 times. We'll usually get a result which is representative of the population as a whole. we'll have a decent idea of how much faith to have in our answer because the math is all very similar to flipping coins. It's all kind of similar, same-ish math. If the population of the country is like 55% people who want to vote for one candidate and 45% people who want to vote for the other candidate, and we ask 300 people, then we're expecting to get like 165 voting for one candidate and 135 voting for the other candidate. And we know that the variance that is going to go into that is going to be like plus or minus 20 or something like that. 15. I don't know exactly, but like that sort of vague ballpark. And I know that despite having never done a sample of voters for the presidential election, because I know that it's like pretty similar to flipping coins. It's kind of the same thing. And a really important thing about sampling, though, and this is incredibly important, is that when you flip a coin, you generally trust that the coin is fair and it's equally likely to land on heads or tails. If it isn't, then you have a bit of a problem. When you take a sample of a population of people, you also need that sample to be fair. And generally, what is meant when we're talking about a fair sample is that every person is equally likely to be chosen and asked the question. If you're trying to take a sample of the population of voters, but you're much, much, much more likely to ask voters who are likely to vote for one candidate in particular, perhaps a certain age range prefers one candidate to the other, and you're asking this question of college students who tend to be in that age range, or a certain socioeconomic class prefers one candidate to the other, and you're asking this question of college students who happen to be in a higher socioeconomic class, or so on and so forth, right? If you're doing that, you're not actually getting what is called a properly representative simple random sample of the voting population. And because of that, it's like you're flipping a coin wrong. You're not actually going to find out much about what the coin is like. It's like you're flipping a coin by like picking it up and then putting it down with heads face up over and over again. And you're going to find out that you get heads a lot of the time, but you're not going to actually find out much real information about flipping a coin. So, yeah, it can be quite difficult to get a simple random sample. There are all sorts of things going on. Some people might say they'll vote, but then not actually vote. You get garbage. If you put garbage into statistics, you will get garbage out. And if you put bias into statistics, you will get bias out. It's not a magical tool which is going to tell you the truth if you do it wrong. All right, so that's like the statistics stuff. Let's talk about big data, where there are lots and lots and lots of data points. We now live in a world where companies and governments can have access to huge amounts of data about their customers or constituents. And a lot of the time, having lots of data is presented as meaning that the conclusions that you reach are true. But having lots of data doesn't necessarily provide more understanding than a simple random sample of constituents would. We already showed like asking just 300 people is like flipping a coin 300 times. And if you do that well, you get pretty close to the truth. We know that because we know what it's like to flip 300 coins, and we know that it usually gets pretty close to the truth. So what exactly is the value of instead of having 30 million people you asked or something like that? What actually happens pretty easily is that the data can be misleading because there may be repeated bias deciding whether you have data on someone or not. So you might be flipping the coin wrong. And when you're flipping a coin like 160 million times or something, it's a lot harder to flip the coin right every single time if you're doing it 160 million times. A problem with big data sets is that it can be really hard to see the humanity in a huge data set as well. This is a quote from The Blast, a Californian publication in 1916. There is double the pathos for us in the death of one little New York waif from hunger than there is in a million deaths from famine in China. That quote may have perhaps gone on to be the quote that is often attributed to Stalin: one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. I don't know. But when I was researching that quote to see if it was actually Stalin, I think he took it from a satirist. Uh, I found that quote from the Californian publication and thought it was actually kind of sweeter. So statistics is a historical tool. It's not absolute good, truth, or evil. It's just something that we can use to do things. Many of the worst things done in the last 100 years have been achieved with the help of statistics. It describes large populations, and so it has a hand in doing bad things to large populations. On the other hand, much of our useful and beneficial knowledge has also been arrived at with the help of statistics and understanding how to help large populations. Like so many other modern tools like the internet and social media and television, artificial intelligence, economics, assembly lines, statistics are not abstractly good or bad, they're as good or as bad as what they are used to achieve. Example of statistics like not necessarily being great. It's evidence that Viagra is great for relieving menstrual pain. This is something that we know because we've done a statistical study suggesting it. But with how we collect data, we tend to underrepresent people who can become pregnant in medical trials. And there's a reasonable ethical concern here. There's a reasonable reason that we do this. We don't want somebody to be in a medical trial where they consented to taking a drug which we're not sure what the side effects could be on them. And then for them to get pregnant, and all of a sudden we're dealing with a pregnant person taking this drug, and it was never intended for that use. That would be bad. However, also, some of this might just be like laziness and a bit of misogyny. We have kind of gotten behind in women's health in some ways because we are so hesitant to trial drugs on women in a lot of situations. But yeah, because of not including people who can get pregnant in medical trials a lot of the time, we can perform thousands of medical studies, have a huge wealth of data. But if we don't include people who can become pregnant, we won't ever have a chance to find out how the medicine actually affects them. There's a link to a study showing that Viagra can be really useful for relieving menstrual pain. Viagra was discovered in 1989. It was approved for use in 1998. The first study of use for period cramps, to my knowledge, was between 2007 and 2011 and found moderate evidence of good effect, but it only had 25 participants and has had relatively little further progress since then. What we choose to do statistics on and what we choose to do with the results that we get, it's not like decided by the statistics, it's decided by the society that we live in. Women's health, just more generally, can be systemically under-prioritized in this sort of way, so ADHD has been better studied in boys than girls, for example, and there are all sorts of examples of this sort of thing. If you repeatedly leave out some sort of person from your data, you won't consider them in decision making, is just the thing that is true about big data. So 92% of Americans access the internet in 2023. That means 8% didn't. If you have data about people using the internet, you are missing 8% of Americans. About 28% of Americans don't use social media. If you're using data about Americans on social media, you are not representing 28% of Americans. 25% of Americans don't have a driver's license. Some of that is adults who don't have a driver's license for any number of reasons. Some of it is people who have gotten too old to be healthy enough to have driver's licenses. Some of it is because people are too young to have driver's licenses yet. But if you look at data on drivers in America, like 25% of Americans don't have a driver's license. That's a huge chunk of the population. About a third of Americans eligible to vote don't vote. About 7% of American residents are not American citizens. So if you are collecting data on people who don't do some of these things, you're going to end up with data which is not actually that useful for telling you what Americans as a whole are like. And this is the sort of problem that you run into regularly with big data, is that you are not actually collecting a representative data set of the population. It is failing to represent some of the people in the population in some way. In conclusion, data points are observations of the world, and how useful they are depends heavily on how fairly they've been collected and how appropriately their importance is weighted. More data doesn't mean better data. And perhaps the most important thing of all, in my opinion, the power of statistics isn't in being able to analyze huge amounts of data. We wouldn't have needed the field of statistics to analyze huge amounts of data. The power of statistics is that it can accurately and actionably analyze huge populations of people using small amounts of data. We can do a medical trial with only 30 people in it, and it can be enough to save thousands and thousands of people from a disease after we see what that medical trial says. And that's, yeah, my presentation on sample sizes. Hope you enjoyed.